So before we begin, let's generate our motivation. And especially since today is election day, and as individuals and as a country, we've been through a lot leading up to this, with much non-virtue being created. Then today, let's really focus on creating virtue to benefit not only ourselves, but the country, the world, all sentient beings, looking beyond just today and this life, creating the kind of virtue that will result in full awakening for self and others. So let's have that be our intention of sharing the Dharma today and for the whole upcoming week. So, welcome to the Abbey, everybody. As we're going to start our week-long holiday with the Buddha. So I want to just start by acknowledging and dedicating the merit of the offering of the books that you have all received. We were asked to dedicate the merit to Nyom Mui, Lo Chong-ing, and Tang Pek Ha. And so if people could make prayers for those people, that they meet the Dharma, that they quickly attain realizations, and in the process of this life have happiness and longevity, then that's a good way for us to repay their kindness in donating a copy of the book to everybody. So you've all received your copies? Yeah. No. See somebody after the class and you'll get your copy of the book. Okay. So last year, about this time, we started the book, and so I wanted to spend this session in particular reviewing what we've gone through already, so that people will kind of have where we're starting off in context, okay, instead of jumping in the middle of something. So first of all, why is this book important? And what was His Holiness's intention in writing it? And he's been talking a lot about being 21st century Buddhists, you know, and the importance, of Buddhism being practiced in our world now, and adaptations that we as practitioners need to make in our minds to be 21st century Buddhists. So it's not changes to the Dharma, because the path to awakening functions at all times for everybody. That's not to be changed. But in our attitudes and maybe some of the cultural manifestations, change can be made. But in particular, what His Holiness is pointing out is in the past, Buddhists from different countries didn't know each other. There was not modern communication or modern transportation. So it took a long time to get from one place to another, and then even if you got there, you couldn't speak the language. So Buddhism, as it spread from northern India throughout to South Asia, Southeastern Asia, into to the West, to Afghanistan, Pakistan, to the north into Central Asia, Tibet, across the Silk Road, to the northeast, to China, Korea, Japan. In the southeast it got as far as Indonesia. So you had different Buddhist traditions develop and different customs develop within those traditions. And we need to know about each other now. If we're talking about global economy and we're talking about global climate change, then we need to talk about global Buddhism with Buddhists understanding each other. So that doesn't mean that we're going to mix up all the traditions and make them all one, but rather that whatever tradition or traditions we practice, we know about the other Buddhist traditions and we respect them. And so the kind of knowledge that His Holiness wanted people to have wasn't just, all Buddhists bow and the Theravadas kneel before they bow and the Chinese stay down when they bow and the Tibetans stand up when they bow. That's not the kind of similarities and differences he wanted people to understand. What he wanted people to understand was the doctrine and to see how the basic teachings of the Buddha are the same across traditions, and how different traditions have emphasized different points or interpreted or fleshed out, I should say, different points in different ways. And so to learn from each other instead of thinking, well, this is my tradition and it's the best one and other ones are inferior, they don't have the true Dharma, or what they're practicing won't get you to awakening, or whatever kind of nonsense there is. Yeah? And so for people to have that kind of understanding and genuine respect, that can lead to Buddhists working together in the world for the benefit of the Dharma and the benefit of sentient beings. Okay, so that's his purpose and why the book was written. And so we're going to start learning about the different traditions. I make comment on it, that because I did most of the Theravada, or I should say Pali tradition research in the book, that I learned a tremendous amount from doing that, and also research into the Chinese tradition. And it really benefited my own practice. Yeah, it didn't make me confused. It benefited what I've already been practicing. So I hope it will also do that for you. Okay. So to see the similarities without discounting the differences. His Holiness has always emphasized that also in interfaith dialogue, with people from other religions. Whenever people try and say, well, we're all one anyway, he says, well, no, not actually. We may have different belief systems, different philosophies, and we don't have to have the same philosophy to get along. Yeah. Which is funny, because we all kind of think, well, we get along if we all believe the same thing. And His Holiness is saying, no, that's not necessary to get along. We can believe different things and still respect each other. So what unifies us so that we can all get along with each other is our common humanity, our common wish to have happiness and not have suffering. Yeah. And an awareness that we live interdependent with other living beings. Yeah, that we can't just live on our own. Our happiness is dependent on others, and our actions affect others. Yeah, and so to have a sense of more universal responsibility towards other living beings, not just sticking out hanging out with our own little group, our own little clan. Okay? So in organizing the material in the book, we started with the history, okay? And I won't go into that in too much depth right now, except to tell you why it was important to talk about history. Because mostly when we come to the Dharma to study it, we don't study its history. We just hear the teachings themselves. Or if we study the history, it's from the viewpoint of a particular tradition, and it's also imbued with the legends and all sorts of other things from that tradition. Yeah. And so to be able to see the history, that yes, there's the standard history, and the standard is only according to each group, because each group tells its own history differently, okay? And that they all have, different, some people may call it legends, some people call it accounts, it depends on your belief, okay? And so they may have their own, set of miracles or whatever. And then you also have the academic, account of Buddhist history. And so that can be kind of confusing for people. And I think it's very good to have a very broad mind and see that in terms of Buddhist practice, maybe the traditional accounts of things gives us a level of faith and appreciation, but also the academic accounts of things give us a more cultural, social, economical, political view of what was going on at the time the teachings were being transmitted. Because, and this is important because Buddhism doesn't exist isolated from human beings' minds. Okay? It exists in a culture. It exists in countries that have certain economic things going on at different historical times. They exist in places where politics are one way this century, another way the next century. Where different sociological things are going on, different intellectual movements are happening, and all of these influence how the teachings are expressed. Okay? For example, in ancient India, the culture was very much people debated each other. You had the Buddhists, you had the non-Buddhists, you had so many different religious and philosophical traditions, and they all talked to each other and debated each other and tried to get at the truth. And if one group lost, it converted to the other group's philosophy because everybody's trying to get at what's true. So you had this very alive culture, very dynamic, interchange between people with a multitude of various beliefs and views. Okay, when Buddhism went to Tibet, it first had to deal with Bon, but then most of the population became Buddhist very easily. So by the time Atisha went there in the 10th, 11th century, almost everybody was Buddhist. So they didn't want or need all these, philosophical debates at the beginning. They need more practical instruction on how to really practice. And so Atisha wrote his very famous book, The Lamp of the Path, and he taught mostly refuge and karma. Okay. Now Buddhism is coming to the West, to a very educated public, where people have studied different philosophies, where people question a lot. So we need the philosophical tradition to be brought, to be emphasized more here in the West. The Tibetans emphasized it in the monasteries as they passed down the teachings, but not so much in the promulgation to the lay society, which was more interested in having pujas and blessings and things like that. But now in, other countries, the lay people want to learn the teachings and the philosophy, So, how things are in different countries at different time periods affect how the teachings are explained. Okay? So that's why the history part is quite important. Basically, at the end of the day, we don't really know what the Buddhist history was. No matter who's telling it, whether it's the Buddhist traditions themselves or the academics, we don't really know. Okay? Because, there's things that we find, especially the things carved in stone, they give us some knowledge of some small thing who donated to the stone things. But, the text, some of them we found, most of them we haven't found. Yeah. So we're not even really sure what language the Buddha spoke. They say he spoke a kind of Prakrit, but Prakrit, there's many dialects to it. There's many forms. Yeah. So, when Buddhism went south it got spread to Sri Lanka first in the 4th century, 3rd, 4th century BC. And so for them, they got a certain set of teachings, and history occurred on that island. And, they hardly knew what was going on in India over the centuries as Buddhism was developing there. And similarly, the people in North India or in Afghanistan, they didn't know what was going on in Sri Lanka, how Buddhism was developing. So, everybody had their own traditions, their own way of tracing themselves back to the Buddha and declaring themselves the authentic holders of the Dharma. But, many scriptures were lost. They were all written on birch bark. How long does birch bark last? Not very long. So, all the schools talk about there being 18 early Buddhist schools, but nobody has it's so funny, there's so many different versions of what the 18 schools are. Yeah, and different ways of categorizing the 18 schools. And we only have the Vinayas of 3 of those 18 schools extant now. And actually there were more than 18 if you count all the different varieties, even though everybody says there were 18. So what I'm getting at is we don't really know, okay? But what we do know, I think, is interesting, and I know for me, maybe because I studied, I was interested in the social sciences, it's very helpful to see Buddhism as it relates to the environment in which it grows, and then to think about what is Buddhism and what is culture. Yeah, and to be able to differentiate those in our minds so we don't get them confused. Yeah, quite important. Also, to realize that different scriptures went to different places according to when Buddhism went there. Yeah, so when Buddhism first went south to Sri Lanka, they got the early Buddhist scriptures. The Mahayana scriptures, while the Mahayanas believed they were spoken by the Buddha, they were passed down in a very private way and did not become public until centuries later. Some of those scriptures went to South Asia, Southeast Asia, and were adopted there. But in Sri Lanka, one of the kings in the 12th century said, what happened is there was differences in opinions among the various monasteries, and the king settled it, and he said, we're following this monastery. The other two monasteries are being shut down, and those monks either become disciples of this monastery or you disrobe. And so Mahayana, the Mahayana influence went away after that because of the decision that was made. So they got mostly the early Buddhist teachings. Buddhism started going to China in the 1st century BC, so they got a lot of the early Buddhist teachings as well. Their canon has a whole section that is completely in common with the Pali canon practice used in South and Southeast Asia. And then they also got a lot of the Mahayana teachings as well. They got some of the Indian commentaries, but not all of them, because the major, by the time some of the Nalanda was flourishing and some of the later commentaries were written, Buddhism had already been in China for centuries. They already had tons of texts. They had already translated many things. They had already started writing their own commentaries. So, for example, Chandrakirti, who, the Tibetans rely on so much, his work was not translated into Chinese. Yeah, and the Chinese have a whole Shastra by Nagarjuna that the Tibetans don't have. I'm not sure quite why it never went to Tibet. But you see, so you also have the differences in canons. Yeah, some of the tantras went to China, but Tantra and Chinese culture didn't go real well together, so it never became very popular. But Tantra went to Tibet, and people loved it. Also because when you had the basic movement of a lot of texts going into Tibet, it was when Tantra was flourishing in India. Yeah, so those were the things that were, really important in India in that time, and those things got taken to Tibet. So, just to have that kind of historical background, I think is really important. And to see now, with things coming to the West, what are we getting? Yeah, and how much has been translated for us? And to what extent are we depending on the sutras, on the Indian commentaries, on the Tibetan commentaries, on the Western commentaries? And to just have an awareness of this and see how all of this is impacting us in our practice. Okay. Then in the book, to continue how we organized it, we talked about refuge, because refuge is what all the Buddhists have in common, and refuge in the 3 jewels is what makes you a Buddhist. After that, we went into the 4 truths, the 4 truths of the Aryas, because those are the basic Buddhist teachings shared by all the traditions. Within the 4 truths, the last one is the true path, what you practice to get out of samsara. And within that, it is explained the 3 higher trainings. So then we went into those: higher training in ethical conduct, in concentration, in wisdom. In conjunction with the higher training in wisdom, then there's a chapter on selflessness and emptiness, and another chapter on dependent arising. Then a chapter on uniting serenity and insight, because after you've mastered, the 3 higher trainings, at least intellectually, then you have to really gain the realization. So serenity and insight become foremost at that point. And then a chapter on the different stages, grounds and paths, how you progress, what you realize when. Okay. From there, we went into the side of the path that deals with with love and compassion and bodhicitta. And I think this is especially important. We started out with the four immeasurables. And, one reason I was saying that this book was written was His Holiness's, wish to get rid of a lot of the old stereotypes that the different traditions have about each other, simply because they didn't know or because of misinformation. So one of the old stereotypes is that the people in the Pali tradition are selfish because they want to become arhats, so they have no love and compassion. So this chapter on the four immeasurables shows what love, compassion, joyous joy and equanimity, how they're taught and practiced in the Pali tradition to get rid of that kind of misconception. In the same way, in the previous chapter on serenity, the Tibetans think that all the Chan people do blank-minded meditation because there was one, Chinese monk who taught at Samye, a Tibetan monastery, in the early days. Well, they don't all do blank-minded meditation. So, in the Serenity chapter, it talks about how the Chinese practice serenity. Okay? All the other traditions think that the Tibetans, practice magic and have sex and drink because of Tantra. So, in the chapter of Tantra, then it's explaining more what the actual practice of Tantra is and, what the philosophy behind it is. Okay, so this has a lot to do with it. So we have the four immeasurables, then we talk about bodhicitta. There are teachings on bodhicitta and the path to Buddhahood in the Pali tradition. Most people in the Mahayana traditions don't know that, but it exists. Then there's discussion of the bodhisattva trainings, how the paramis, or in Pali, or paramitas in Sanskrit, how they're practiced in the two traditions, what they are. Then on Buddha nature, and then finally a chapter on Tantra. Okay, so trying to cover all the major topics, how things are organized. So, to continue reviewing, I wonder how many sessions it's going to take me to review. You know me. Oh dear. But I think the review is important. Otherwise, because we didn't have the teachings from last year on the web, so otherwise people are kind of stuck. I hope you read the book, but I'm not necessarily assuming that. Okay, so chapter on refuge. I just want to point out some highlights here, because the chapter talks about how the three jewels are seen in both the Pali tradition and the Sanskrit tradition. I want to read one section here. It's on page 18 and 19. And if you get nothing else after this course, if you have some inkling of what these 2 pages mean, then it's been a total success. This is quite profound. It's abbreviated here, but this is really proving the existence of the three jewels. Okay, Nagarjuna does it in his Karikas, and Tsongkhapa explained it more, and His Holiness teaches this. And I remember one time listening to him teach this and just going, wow, this is it. So, there's much to understand, and I can't say in fact, I don't understand it all. Okay. So in the Pali, I'll read this section because it's important. In the Pali and Sanskrit traditions, the Buddha said that whoever sees the interdependent nature of phenomena sees the Dharma, and whoever sees the Dharma sees the Tathagata. Nagarjuna explained that the key to verifying the existence of the three jewels is understanding the interdependent nature of phenomena. Okay, His Holiness was once asked if Buddhism had a slogan, what would it be? And his answer was dependent arising, the interdependent nature. Upon examination, we find that persons and phenomena are dependent. There are three aspects of dependent. One, conditioned things depend on their causes and condition. A sprout arises from a seed, and our experiences depend on our previous actions or karma. That's already very important. You know, if we really understood how we're dependent on causes and conditions, our whole view of life would change. Our whole view of who we were would change. 2, all phenomena, both the impermanent and the permanent, depend on their constituent parts. Our body is made of parts such as arms, legs, and internal organs, and these are made of other parts. Our mind is composed of a sequence of tiny moments of mind that form its continuum. So again, things are dependent on parts. Yeah. And you see how this kind of goes against a lot of our assumptions on life? You know, that things are fixed, that we're wholes, you know, we're not things put together by parts, when in fact we are. On the third level, on the subtlest level, all phenomena depend on the mind that conceives and designates them. On the basis of 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head, and so on, a mind conceives and designates body. In dependence on the collection of body and mind, we impute person. Okay, so just how things are dependent on term and concept. Again, we don't think about that in our daily life. We don't see the world around us or ourselves in that light. Ignorance, the root of samsara, grasps all persons and phenomena as having a self, an independent, inherent essence, unrelated to anything else, such as causes and conditions, parts, and the mind that conceives and designates them. Okay, so right there, look what His Holiness did. He explained 3 kinds of dependent arising that we can think about and see are true. And then he says, what does ignorance apprehend? The exact opposite of dependent arising. Ignorance apprehends things as existing with their own nature, independent of causes and conditions, unrelated to parts, having nothing to do with the mind that conceives and designates them. Okay? So the reality, you know, is this interdependent nature, and ignorance apprehends the opposite of that. Okay? So ignorance is an erroneous mind. Okay? Because all persons and phenomena exist dependent on other factors, they are empty of independent or inherent existence. So things are dependent, ignorance apprehends the opposite. In reality, things are empty of what? Ignorance apprehends, what ignorance grasps. Okay. Thus, ignorance is an erroneous mind since it lacks a valid basis. Very important to understand that ignorance is not a reliable cognizer. It doesn't see things accurately as they are. Wisdom, on the other hand, is a reliable mind since it apprehends reality. It realizes that all persons and phenomena are empty of inherent existence because they exist dependent on other factors. So ignorance understands both emptiness and dependent arising. And it sees how they're related, and how because things are dependent, therefore they're empty of inherent existence. And because things are empty of inherent existence, they do exist dependently. So wisdom perceives both of these things and sees them as complementary, not contradictory. Okay. Wisdom's apprehension of reality can overpower ignorance. Okay, because ignorance apprehends things incorrectly, and wisdom apprehends them correctly. Yeah, the correct view always can overpower the incorrect one. And with repeated meditation, wisdom can completely eradicate ignorance from our mind streams, making liberation possible. Okay? So when we have the correct view and we integrate that with our mind, then automatically ignorance is erased. Ignorance cannot stand up. It has no ability to fight back against wisdom. So it can be overcome. Now, this is really important. In this way, knowledge of dependent arising helps us to understand the four truths that form the basic framework of the Buddha's teachings. Okay, here we're going to come the brilliant part. Proving the four truths. True dukkha, true origin, true cessation, true path. Ignorance, misapprehending reality, gives rise to afflictions. Ignorance, anger, these things. These afflictions create karma and lead to dukkha. Dukkha means all the unsatisfactory conditions in samsara. This is the truth of dukkha and the truth of its origin, the first two truths of the Aryas. Aryas are the beings who perceive reality directly. Knowledge of dependent arising also enables us to understand emptiness and selflessness. So you see, we've already proven the first two truths. Okay? Then, dependent arising and selflessness. Yeah? Persons and other phenomena are empty of independent existence because they are dependent. Emptiness and dependent arising are established by reasoning and can be directly experienced. So this is important, They're established by reasoning, not by belief, not because the Buddha said so, not because they sound good, not because all our friends like it, but we have to establish it in our own mind through reasoning. In our own mind through reasoning. But it's not just something that is established intellectually. Yeah, emptiness can be directly experienced. Yeah, so it's also something we use reasoning to get to know emptiness originally, and then through deep meditation we're able to perceive it directly. The wisdom understanding emptiness is the fourth truth, the true path, which counteracts ignorance, wrong views, and afflictions that are founded on the misapprehension of reality. Okay, so there we have the true path, the fourth truth. In this way, we can actualize a state in which all ignorance and afflictions have been removed. This is nirvana, true cessation, the third truth. So right there, on the basis of dependent arising, he established the existence of the four truths. Yeah, knowing that the four truths exist is a big thing. It's the whole framework, the whole basis of what we're doing. Okay? Now, he's going to go from there, how the four truths exist, into how the three jewels exist. Thus the four truths of the Aryas exist. The last two of the Four Truths, true cessations and true paths, are the Dharma Jewel. So there we have the Dharma Jewel. Okay. Persons who have actualized at least some of these paths and cessations in their continuum are the Sangha Jewel. There's the Sangha Jewel. When they progress to the point where all afflictions and obscurations have been eliminated and all paths and qualities brought to perfection, they become the Buddha Jewel. So there you have the three jewels. Thus, beginning with the fact that all phenomena are empty of independent existence, yet arise dependent on other factors, we can prove the existence of the three jewels. So when we take refuge in the three jewels, it initially, when our ignorance is strong and our wisdom is weak, there's a lot of some kind of, a leap of faith in it. The more we examine with wisdom, the more our wisdom increases, our reasoning ability increases, and we can see things, establish things through reasoning and then directly experience them. The more, the refuge becomes something really live for us, and it doesn't depend at all on blind belief. Okay? So I think this is something really, really special about Buddhism, is, at the end, the more we go into the teachings and establish their veracity through reasoning and through experience, then the more, faith comes to mean something other than blind faith. It's a faith established. Faith isn't even a good word. It's a confidence in the three jewels. It's a trust in the three jewels that gets established because we've been able to see with reasoning and experience that they actually exist, and that this path is true and reliable. Okay. For this reason, the Buddha said that those who see interdependence see the Dharma, and those who see the Dharma see the Tathagata. It's brilliant, isn't it? I mean, you have to go over this a few times, like a lot, over many lifetimes, to really get it. But, even when you just start to get a little inkling of what's going on, it's just brilliant. Understanding this increases our faith and trust in the three jewels, because we understand the possibility of mental development that leads to actualizing the three jewels. In this way, understanding the Four Truths gives us confidence that not only can we trust the three jewels as our spiritual guides, leading us to full awakening, but we can also become the three jewels ourselves. Okay? So this is so different from theistic religions. In theistic religions, whatever, your refuge is, you can never become that. There's a gap between you, and the ultimate refuge. Here, we can become fully awakened Buddhists. The historical order of the existence of the three jewels and their order of generation for individual practitioners differ. Historically, the Buddha appeared first. He then gave Dharma teachings. On the basis of practicing these, people gained realizations. Disciples possessing realizations, or Aryas, the Sangha. So historically, we had Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. An individual practitioner, in contrast to the historical view, first actualizes the Dharma Jewel by cultivating true path and actualizing true cessation. Thus he becomes the Sangha Jewel. So first is the Dharma Jewel, Sangha Jewel. By further enhancing the Dharma Jewel in his mind until he is fully awakened, he becomes the Buddha Jewel. Okay. So, like I said, if that's all we understand, even a little bit, that's good. That's quite enough. Yeah. That doesn't mean you can sleep the rest of the course, though. Okay. Then to point out in Refuge, for those of you who've read or studied, that there's many aspects of the descriptions of the three jewels that are in common between the Pali and Sanskrit traditions. So, such as it's called the four fearlessnesses in the Tibetan tradition. That's how it's translated. In Pali, they translate the same term as the four types of self-confidence of a Buddha. Those are shared in the two traditions. So are the 10 powers of the Buddha. Yeah, the 18 unshared qualities of the Buddha were explained in later Pali texts, and so those are also shared in the Sanskrit tradition, where they're quite prominent. Okay, so a lot of the descriptions of the three jewels are in common. Okay, then I want to read a little bit more on page 25. The Buddha is praised as the one who actualized the Dharma and taught it to others. A famous passage in the Pali Canon describes the relationship of the Dharma and the Buddha. When speaking to the monk Vakali, who was gravely ill and regretted not having been able to see the Buddha sooner. So his whole life had gone by. He had wanted to see the Buddha. He never got there. Yeah, always some reason, had to drive, do something else. He never got to see the Buddha. He's dying, and the Buddha comes to him. And so he expresses his regret not having been able to see the Buddha. And the Buddha scolds him, but he scolds him in a... Scolding doesn't have to mean that somebody's angry at you, Scolding is meaning that he's just saying something in a strong way to get a point across. And he says, "Enough, Vakali. Why do you want to see this foul body? One who sees the Dharma sees me. One who sees me sees the Dharma." In other words, why are you so full of regret when you're dying because you haven't seen me with this foul body made of flesh and blood? What's that seeing this flesh and blood body going to do for you? If you see the Dharma, if you see dependent arising and emptiness, then you've seen the Tathagata. Okay? And if you've seen the Buddha, the Tathagata, really seen the Buddha, then of course you've seen the Dharma. So seeing the Buddha doesn't mean with our eyes. It means with our mind, with realizations. Okay. So seeing the Buddha, seeing and knowing the Buddha is not done physically, but through mental development. Being close to the Buddha means actualizing the same true paths and true cessations he has. The extent to which our minds have been transformed into the Dharma is the extent to which we see the Buddha. Okay? So it's how much we've put the Dharma into practice and been transformed by it. That's what makes us close to the Buddha. Okay? That's what makes us close to our teachers. I remember one time in Dharamsala, Sangha Rinpoche was there, and I remember Lama Yeshe was in his room talking to him, and Sangha Rinpoche was sitting up high, and Lama was sitting on the floor like this in front of his teacher. And and they're both of them were my teachers, you know. And I looked at them and I said, wow, they're really close, guru-disciple. What is it that makes them close? Bodhichitta. You know, they have the same purpose in life, the same focus in life. Bodhichitta, yeah, wanting to realize emptiness for the benefit of others. That's what makes them a very close guru-disciple. Yeah, not because Lama was a groupie hanging around Sangha Rinpoche. Yeah. So I think it would be good if we Westerners understood this some more. Okay, so the Pali continues. Here the Blessed One shows himself as the Dharma Body, or the Dharmakaya. Interesting mention of the Dharmakaya in the Pali tradition. Okay. As stated in the passage, the Tathagata, Great King, is the Dharma Body. For the ninefold supramundane Dharma, the four Arya paths, their fruits, and nirvana, is called the Tathagata Body. So when they say body, they're not talking about the Buddhist physical body. Okay? They're talking about the realizations of the four pairs of Aryas. Yeah, so their realizations, which are and nirvana itself, that those things are really what the Dharmakaya is. Yeah, so what are those realizations, or in whose mind do you have those realizations? Okay, according to the Pali tradition speaks a lot about four pairs: the approachers and abiders to stream entry, approachers and abiders in once returners, the approachers and abiders of non-returners, and the approacher and abiders of arhatship. Okay, and so they describe the path in terms of these four pairs, you know, and that's how, you know, first you become a stream enter, then a once returner, non-returner, and an arhat, according to the what you have removed from your mind, you know, how they describe the afflictions, what has been removed from the mind, and the extent to which you are familiar with nirvana. Okay, so that's how they describe that. I don't want to go into the whole description right now, but you can read it in the book. Okay, the Mahayana, or I should say the Sanskrit tradition, it's a bit difficult, you know, because both the Sanskrit and Pali traditions have the hearer path, the solitary realizer path, and the bodhisattva path. Yeah, so they have the three paths, and they have teachings on those three vehicles. Yeah, but still we divide, because some scriptures are primarily written in Pali, some primarily were written in Sanskrit. Okay, so in the Sanskrit tradition, they emphasize, you know, they accept those four pairs of stream enters, once returners, non-returners, and arhats. They accept nirvana. And then they also add on the bodhisattva's grounds, how the bodhisattvas practice. And the way the Buddha is described is a little bit different in the Pali tradition and Sanskrit tradition. In the Pali tradition, in the sutras, they didn't really say a whole lot about what nirvana is and what happens after somebody attains it. Yeah, except to say that it's the cessation of ignorance, anger, and attachment, and that all the afflictions have ceased, and the karma to be reborn in samsara has been ceased, okay? That can no longer ripen. Yeah? So everybody accepts that. And the Pali Sutras didn't go a whole lot beyond that. Yeah? Some people say, based on one passage in one of the Pali Suttas, where the Buddha was referring to ignorance, anger, and attachment being ceased. Some people on the basis of that say the consciousness is ceased. So after an arhat, when an arhat first attains nirvana, he has this foul body, and when he passes away and leaves this foul body, then there's no cause for rebirth, and so the continuity of consciousness stops, and the arhat has been nirvanaized, okay, transformed into nirvana. In the Sanskrit tradition, it said that just because the afflictions have been eliminated from the mind, that doesn't mean that the continuity of the mind itself stops, because there's nothing that can actually stop that causal sequence of one moment of mind producing another moment of mind, producing the next, producing the next. There's nothing that can impede that. So the afflictions can be eliminated. The clear and knowing nature of the mind can continue, and it can continue all the way until Buddhahood. Okay, and so in that way, they describe the Buddha as, they say actually in the Sanskrit tradition that the Buddha was enlightened a long time ago, but appeared as Shakyamuni, having a family life and practicing the path and all those things, as an example for us, showing how we need to practice. Even though he was actually enlightened a long time ago. That was a manifestation done for our benefit. And so they say that's an emanation body of the Buddha, emanated from this Dharmakaya mind, which is the true cessations and true paths in a Buddhist continuum. Okay? So when they talk about the Dharmakaya in the Sanskrit tradition, they're talking about the Buddha's omniscient mind, as well as the true cessations and the emptiness of that mind. When they talk about the form bodies of the Buddha, they're talking about the way that the Buddha manifests in different physical forms in order to communicate with sentient beings, because the Buddha's someone's whole reason for becoming a Buddha is to benefit sentient beings. Okay, so then you have the enjoyment body, which is like a body of light, the way the Buddha appears to the highly realized Aryas in the Pure Land, and the emanation body, how a much grosser type of appearance for us. Okay, so that's the way the Buddha is described in the Sanskrit tradition. Whereas in the Pali tradition, some people just say, well, the Buddha got nirvanaized and there, that's it. Although not all people following the Pali tradition believe that. Okay, there was, His Holiness found this very interesting when I told him, when I went to, because he asked me to go to Thailand and investigate. So I was staying at one Thai monastery, and in their lineage of practitioners, there was one Achan Mun who lived late 19th and into the middle of the 20th century, and he had visions of the Buddhas and the Arhats. And so he didn't think that they had all been, their continuity of mind had all been ceased. Yeah, and Achan Bua is also part of that tradition, and he says that the clarity of the citta, the mind, continues after nirvana. So there's different positions within the Pali tradition. Actually, I should say, when we talk about Pali tradition and Sanskrit tradition, we're not talking about monolith traditions. Within each one, you have all sorts of different branches. And within each branch, you have different views. And within each view, you have different monasteries, each with their own way of doing things. And in different monasteries, you have individuals who think differently too. Okay? So we're never talking about, and each individual thinks differently from one day to the next too. Okay, so whenever we're using these terms, we're not talking about monolithic things that everybody ascribes to. It's important to understand. Okay. Then, from there, we go into the Four Truths. So the Four Truths each have 16 aspects. What's interesting is that the list of the 16 aspects in the Sanskrit tradition and in the Pali tradition, the two are not the same. They have two different lists of what the 16 aspects of the Four Truths are. However, what the points in one, the other one also believes. And the points in this one, this tradition also accepts. Okay, so it's not like they're pointing out totally different things. Yeah, there are different levels of understanding, especially when it comes to understanding the true cause. What are the true cause of our dukkha? So the definition of dukkha, the definition of ignorance, differs in the different traditions. Yeah. So the way they define the path, the realization of emptiness and selflessness, differs. The way they define true cessation, or nirvana, differs. Yeah. But there's a lot of it, and it differs according to the basic thing that these differences stem on, is how they define what we call the object of negation, the conceived object of ignorance. Yeah. So how they define what it is that ignorance is apprehending or grasping. Yeah, so they have different views on that, and that influences a lot in the traditions. And within the Sanskrit tradition, or at least within Tibet, when they started talking about 4 Buddhist tenet schools, that's, again, one of the basic differences in them, is how they describe what ignorance apprehends. So it's interesting how you describe what doesn't exist. Yeah, that's the big difference, yeah. Okay, some things that are definitely in common, okay, are that both of the traditions talk about impermanence. Gross impermanence, like the weather changing, the sun rising and setting, people being born, people dying. And subtle impermanence, which happens on a momentary basis, because nothing remains the same for even the smallest moment of time. Everything is in constant flux. Everything is arising, abiding, and ceasing at the same time. Okay? So both traditions accept that. Both traditions say that the aggregates, our body and mind, are polluted, meaning that they're under the influence of ignorance, and that they are unsatisfactory. Yeah, that, and this is something so difficult for people in the West to understand, that our body and mind are unsatisfactory. Yeah, that the body is foul in nature. People don't want to hear that in the West. I've taught that. I taught at one Buddhist college where people have been studying for years, and they didn't want to hear that. Yeah? And, that the body is foul. But if, you examine what your body is, just mentally, yeah, it's garbage, isn't it? It's garbage coated by skin. Isn't it? See, you don't believe either. Yeah, you're looking at me. Wait a minute. Body is beautiful. Yeah. And I go to the gym and I play sports and I have nice clothes and, I take care of my skin so it doesn't look old. And I decorate my body and I put on aftershave and perfume and people find me attractive. And my body gives me happiness. Until it doesn't. Until we get sick. Yeah. As we age, our body stops giving us happiness. When we die, the body ultimately betrays us. We spent our whole life taking care of it, and it doesn't come with us. Yeah. And this is something in the West so difficult for people to understand. Okay? And what Nagarjuna says in Precious Garland is the foul, we all want to realize emptiness, right? Because emptiness is what's going to liberate us from cyclic existence. Emptiness is something, is called a slightly obscure phenomena. In other words, it's not something we can know by our senses. We can only know emptiness initially through reasoning. So it's something that it's going to take us a while to really understand. Our senses cannot get at emptiness initially. Okay? The foulness of our body, the fact that if you open up this body, people are all going to go, ew. The fact that everything that comes out of this body, we want to get rid of as, fast as possible. That is something that even our senses know. It's easy to perceive. Okay? But that understanding does not stay in our mind for very long. Yeah, we look at the pee-pee and caca, we flush it away. Yeah. We look at the inside of a body, we sew it up. We cannot hold that in our mind. And yet, understanding the body as foul is easy compared to realizing emptiness. Okay? But we all want to focus on emptiness. Maybe because we're superior disciples who are so intelligent. But we don't want to look at what's right in front of our nose, or maybe what's right inside of our nose. Yeah. Interesting, isn't it? So when you see this, then you begin to understand what ignorance is. Yeah? And this isn't even the ignorance grasping true existence. This is just common ignorance. And we begin to see how ignorant we are, but we think we're very smart. Okay? So, actually, to tell you the truth, I think it's good to discover how ignorant we are, because that means that we can improve. If we're very intelligent and we already saw reality now, then we couldn't improve and we could never get out of samsara. But the fact that we're ignorant means that we can get rid of these wrong beliefs. We can develop wisdom. We can get out of samsara. Okay? So, as they say in Buddhism, get used to being wrong. Yeah? It's actually a relief. Yeah? To find out that sometimes we're wrong and that there's more realistic views than our ridiculous ones. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then all the traditions also talk about emptiness and selflessness. Yeah. How they define them is different, but they all say, they talk about, especially regarding the person, the I, the big I, not the I that sees things, the big I, that person, how it appears and how it actually exists are different. Yeah. So they talk about selflessness, that our apprehension of this big me, I'm here. This is me. Don't you realize who I am? Pay attention to me. I'm right. Yeah, I'm good. What I have is great. My knowledge is the best knowledge. So this incredible grasping, I was just there talking about statements of attachment, but they're all based on this notion that there's this real solid me. Yeah, that we never have questioned. And so both of the traditions, and this is the astounding thing about Buddhism and how it really differs from all other spiritual traditions, is that it says there's not any kind of, permanent, partless, independent person there. There's not any kind of substantially existent controller there. There's not any kind of inherently existent I there. Yeah, the person exists, but not in any of those ways, not in the ways that ignorance apprehends them. Okay, so everybody's agreeing on that. Okay, everybody agrees that, to put it in modern language, samsara sucks. That, that it's not a worthwhile endeavor. Yeah. Of course, that is very hard for us to understand too, because we think samsara is kind of great. You can go to Disneyland, you can get, banana splits, you can, go to Starbucks. You can't do any of those things at the Abbey, sorry folks. But, we think samsara is great, and that the path to happiness is just tweaking our samsara a little bit, getting all those nasty people to go away. Or to become the way we want them to be, and then we'll be happy. But actually, what Buddhism in both the Pali and Sanskrit tradition is saying is you can tweak your samsara all you want, but as long as we're under the influence of ignorance, clinging, attachment, and anger, the whole thing's going to continue, and you're not going to be free. Yeah. So freedom is not the freedom to go and buy whatever you want at the shopping mall. And freedom is not your right to carry a gun into church and schools. Freedom is an internal state when we're free from ignorance, anger, and clinging attachment. Okay? So everybody agrees on that. Okay? Everybody agrees on the true path. We have to realize the Pali tradition calls it the three characteristics: impermanence, dukkha, and then selflessness. Yeah? We also add emptiness to it, and that gets into a lot of philosophy we won't go into right now. But, everybody agrees on, for the true path, that we need the Eightfold Noble Path, we need the three higher trainings. The Eightfold Noble Path can be condensed into the three higher trainings. And we need to realize nirvana. Okay? So, we have a few minutes for questions and comments.
One thing he spoke about, which I didn't know, was the Indian part, that there were Brahmins and there was a higher caste. So is it true that Shakyamuni influenced the fact that many people, all people, could now learn Buddhism despite the caste?
Yeah, right. Yeah. The one thing, the Buddha was a social revolutionary in that way, that he said that the Brahmins were the highest caste. He said, if you want to be a real Brahmin, it's not by birth, it's by wisdom and compassion. Yeah. So he took what people considered to be the highest thing and he totally redefined it in terms of spiritual realizations. And he allowed all the people, of all the castes to ordain, and they were not to make differences among themselves based on caste. Yeah. So similarly, to update that, everybody from all social classes now should be able to ordain, and everybody from all whatever kind of group whatsoever. Yeah. It's open to, the Dharma is open to everybody. Yeah?
Do the different traditions believe in different numbers of Buddhas?
Do the different traditions believe in different number of Buddhas? Yeah. The Sanskrit tradition talks about the 1,000 Buddhas of this fortunate eon. The Pali tradition doesn't. They do talk about past Buddhas and future Buddhas, Maitreya being the next Buddha and so on, but they don't list out 1,000 like that. And in the Pali tradition, they say that not everybody needs to become a Buddha, because Buddhas are only the ones who are the wheel-turning Buddhas, who teach the wheel-turning Buddha, somebody who teaches the Buddha, who teaches the Dharma when the Dharma doesn't exist in society at that historical time. So they say there's only a few Buddhas. In Sanskrit tradition, everybody can become a Buddha. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah? Sure.
I'll make sure. Saw an exhibition at the Ruben Museum on the Dalai Lama's secret altar, and I thought it was going to stay there, but they took it down. What is the secret altar? The Dalai Lama?
I have no idea. If it's secret, then it wouldn't be on display. And I've never heard that term used. Secret altar.
Yeah, I don't think it was really his personally. I just, whoever the Dalai Lama, when they live in the Lama, the Lhasa, when they live there,
Yeah.
Like the Heart Sutra, do you recommend memorizing the 12 dependent originations?
Do I recommend memorizing? Yeah, I think whatever Dharma you can memorize is always very useful. Yeah, we'll get into the 12 links of dependent origination a little bit later. Okay, so it's 10:30. Let's have a break now, and then at 11 o'clock discussion group. We've had a series of talks, a couple of talks on perfectionism, and I thought it would be very useful for people to base their discussion session this time on that topic, especially since this session you got a whole lot of difficult to understand material, and you may have a perfectionist tendency that says, I've got to understand it all right now, and I can't. what's wrong with me? So I think it might be useful to have that discussion. Okay? So